Today is January 6, 2017. I am Tom Stamen, University Archivist, and I am sitting in KVS Studios with retired administrator and faculty member Ray Rowland. How are you doing today, Ray?
I'm doing fine, Tom.
Thanks for coming down on this very cold day and agreeing to talk to me about your time here at St. Cloud State University. And I'm going to start out with a couple questions for you, or do you have something you want to read there?
Oh, no, you go ahead and ask the questions. I'll do my best to answer them.
Perfect. So, Ray, tell us where and when you were born.
Oh, my. We're going to go back that far. I was born in the state of New Mexico in 1929.
1929.
Yes. And I was the sixth of child in our family. And I arrived about the same time the Depression began. So I'm sure my parents were happy to have another addition. And I grew up, my first few years were in New Mexico. Then later we moved to Missouri. I went through most of my schooling in the Ozarks, southern Missouri. And then I went on to college at the University of Minnesota, which started my academic career.
So you were the sixth.
Oh, excuse me.
Oh,
University of Missouri.
University.
Missouri, that's where I got my first degree.
So today you are 87 years old,
That's correct.
and you said you were the sixth of how many children?
Well, 6 children.
Oh, you were
Yeah,
you were the youngest of six.
That's right.
And were your parents immigrants, or were they?
No, they were both born in this country. There's in my background, far back, there's some Scottish and English, a little French perhaps, and maybe even, we're not sure about this, some Native American. But I haven't really done that much research on my ancestry.
What were the name of your parents?
My dad's name was Louis. My mother's name was Ursula.
Ursula. I've never
Ursula.
heard that name before.
It's a different name, yes.
So we'll talk a little bit about your family straight off here. So you're married, Ray. What is your wife's name and maiden name?
Her name is June. Her maiden name was Lee. And we have two daughters. One of them lives here in St. Cloud. One lives in Denver. And a bunch of grandchildren.
What are the names of your daughters, Ray?
Our older daughter is Renee, and our younger daughter is Rhonda.
Renee and Rhonda, and Ray, and well, June had to start with a J, so
Yeah, she had to be different.
she had to be different. That's right. So, all right. So you grew up. You moved to Missouri, and then when did you go to? So when did you graduate from high school?
In 1946,
1946.
right
And
at the end of World War II.
and after high school, where did you go to get your education?
I went to University of Missouri. I got a degree in journalism, and then I went to work at a newspaper, which was owned by my brother, a weekly newspaper. And at that time, I was one of the youngest newspaper editors in Missouri. I graduated from college at the age of 21.
So that would have made it 1950.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's true. I graduated in 50. After some time in the newspaper business, I was drafted during the Korean War, and I spent some time in the Army. I was stationed in various places in the U.S., and then I was sent to Germany. And I was associated with the 2nd Armored Division, and I ended up editor of the division newspaper because of my newspaper background. And that was a very interesting experience.
So you were drafted in what year, Ray?
Let's see, I was married, 51,
51.
yes. and I served for 2 years.
2 years. So at some point you went to Germany. So so you ended up editing the division's newspaper.
Yes, I did. And I got to do quite a bit of traveling on weekends. I took advantage of every opportunity to explore Europe, and it was a good experience.
Had you done much traveling before that or not?
Not really, a bit in the U.S., but not much.
Now, I know we'll talk about this a little later, but did that really spark your interest in international travel when you were stationed in Germany during the Korean War?
It certainly did, yes. Yes, I wanted to be able to take my wife back to Europe, show her some of the places where I had been. And so later on, we took advantage of that opportunity.
Excellent. So 2 years in the during the Korean conflict, you served in Germany, and you were discharged. And what did you do then? So that would have been what, 1953? 53, you were discharged.
That's right. I didn't have a job, but I went to work with my brother. At that time, my older brother had a daily newspaper in Missouri, Lamar, Missouri.
Is that the same paper that you worked at before you were drafted?
Well, no, I was editor of his paper in the town of Seymour, Missouri. It was a weekly paper. That's what I did before I went into the service.
Seymour, Missouri, and then after that you were in Lamar, Missouri.
Yes. And then I had an opportunity to go to Springfield, Missouri, and become a member of the newspaper staff there, a reporter and a feature writer. And I was only there a few months, but it was a good experience. And then I took a job at Monette, Missouri, as editor of a daily paper there. And that was hard work, but I learned a lot. And after being there about a year and a half, 2 years maybe, I left and went to Southern Illinois University, and I worked in the public relations office at that university.
So what year was that, Ray, that you were at Southern Illinois?
That must have been, I'm going to count up here, 53, about 55.
55.
Until 59, yeah.
So you were in public relations at Southern Illinois. What kind of things did you do there? So, or actually, so you became a journalist. What made you interested in going into public relations?
I don't know exactly why. I just happened to get acquainted with the director of the Public Information Office at Southern Illinois, and we hit it off, and he persuaded me to stay on and do writing for that office. And I did a lot of feature writing, news releases, press conferences, and all of those sorts of things. And I enjoyed that. While I was there, I worked on my master's, and I ended up with a master's degree in 59.
From Southern Illinois, you received that?
Yes. So that was my previous experience before I came to St. Cloud.
So it was interesting. It was an interesting story when I talked to Hal Lieberman a couple weeks ago about the job here. So Hal arrived here in 1956. So you're at Southern Illinois. How did you find out? How did you find out about St. Cloud? And did you know anything about St. Cloud at all? Or like, where the heck is St. Cloud? But so explain how the circumstances of all this went down, Ray.
I had never heard of St. Cloud, and I knew very little about Minnesota. I certainly had never been here. So after I received my master's degree in journalism at Southern Illinois, I put my feelers out job hunting, and I got this call from George Budd, who was then the president of St. Cloud, and he invited me to come up for an interview. And so I accepted. I came. We hit it off right away, He showed me around the campus.
Which was very small at the
It was
time.
quite small, under 3,000
Under
students.
3,000 students.
And about 100 faculty, I think. But he convinced me that this institution was going to grow rapidly and become a large university. And he said, you can become part of this if you join in and take this job. So I did.
So what were your first impressions of St. Cloud and your first impressions of President George Budd?
Well, George Budd was from New York, upper New York State, although he had worked in other parts of the country. He was young for a president. I think he was one of the youngest state university presidents in the country at that time. I was impressed. He had a good grasp of what the institution was and what it could become. And he got on well with the faculty, and he brought some really good faculty members onto the campus. He was, among other things, he had Morgan horses, and he was quite good at it. He judged Morgan horse shows, and he showed his horses, and he rode his prize Morgan horse in each homecoming parade. And there's a story about one of his horses, but at one time, students in Shoemaker Hall thought it would be a good prank to go across the river where there was a horse pasture, get one of the president's Morgan horses, bring it back across the river on the 10th Street Bridge into the dorm, which they did. They tried to get it into the elevator to take it up to a higher floor, but the horse balked. So they put it in a lavatory on the first floor. And somehow the police heard about it and came and put a stop to it, and notified the president. Well, it made the national news, this prank, and the president's horse. Turned out, however, it wasn't his horse. It belonged to someone else.
Was it Sandy Sahlstrom? Is that how you say it?
Stan Sahlstrom.
Stan Sahlstrom.
It was one of his. He also had Morgan horses. It was one of his.
Were you here at the time when that happened?
Oh, yes.
So did you have to spin that some way? I can't imagine you getting that press about the president's horse, or what they thought the president's horse was in a dorm at Shoemaker Hall.
Well, it was harmless. I mean, the horse wasn't injured. Nobody was injured. It was a prank, and that's the way we treated it.
So when you arrived here on campus, what did you think? So, Bud, I know obviously, and Bud was right. I mean, the university and lots of other places too were poised to explode with students.
Yes.
What were your first thoughts of campus when you arrived?
Well, I'd been on a pretty large campus, Southern Illinois University, and University of Missouri before that, and so it looked pretty small. But it looked like it had a lot of potential. And I thought under this president, it would grow, and I could grow in my job with the university, or then a college, of course. So I took the job, and we moved, my wife and I and our two daughters moved up here. And the first winter was pretty mild. I thought, I'd heard so much about Minnesota winters, no problem. But after that, real Minnesota winters set in, and it was eye-opening, to say the least. So, but we did get acclimated, and we enjoyed those early years. And what was in the college did grow quite rapidly. Now, George Budd didn't stay here many more years after I came. His salary at that time was only $18,000 a year. no perks. He didn't get a housing, he didn't get a car, he didn't get anything except the salary. Well, he wasn't very happy about that, so he decided maybe he should move into Whitney House and make that his combination home and office. Well, he started to do that, and then the state college board said, no, that's a state property. It wouldn't be appropriate. You can't do that. So he decided it was time to leave. And
So that was summer of 65.
yes.
Yep.
And this is a little interesting bit. He tried to get, his office was in Stewart Hall at that time, first floor. He tried to get through the university a carpet for his office. It was bare floor. He wanted a carpet. No, can't spend money for that. So some of the businessmen in St. Cloud heard about it, and they bought him a carpet, which he put in his office. When he resigned and went to Pittsburgh, Kansas, he rolled up that carpet and took it with him. It was his carpet.
He was going to have that carpet, and hopefully he used it at Pittsburgh State.
He did. Pittsburgh State offered him a higher salary, a house, a car, a maid, a gardener, and a chauffeur, among other things. So it was quite a change from here.
I bet. And he was there, and I'll have to look at the dates, but I know he left in 65, and I believe he retired as president at Pittsburgh State in Kansas.
Yes, he did. Uh-huh.
And he ended up living there, I think,
Yeah.
the remainder of his life there. And he passed away, I think it was 2009 he passed away. He was like 95. So. He was in his mid to upper 90s when he passed away.
Yes. And he still had his horses.
Oh, did he?
His Morgan horses down there, yeah. Anyway, that was my first experience with a president, and it was overall a good experience.
How was it? Obviously, you said that you were, when we were talking before we started, you were the first public relations person here on campus,
Yes.
and so you worked closely with George Budd. And what were those days like? As I'm assuming you were the only person, or did you have a staff person, or what did your job encompass in those early days?
I didn't have a staff, actually. I had a secretary, and she was good. And I had a student who did the sports reporting, and he was good. But I didn't have anybody else for quite a while. As we grew, I was able to add staff, a photographer, a sports information director, an assistant news editor, and well, anyway, we ended up with an office of good people.
So as the campus grew, like everything else, your office grew as well.
Right.
What kind of changes? So when you arrived here in 1959, you saw some pretty rapid changes within, like a year, 2 years that things were changing. So they were expanding. The university was expanding west of First Avenue South. What were your thoughts about the campus expanding and the faculty expanding and the curriculum and everything?
We had a real problem because we had the river on one side of the campus. You couldn't expand into the river. We had industrial area south of the campus. That wasn't desirable. So the only way we could go to expand was to the north and to the west. And that's where there were a lot of residential, very nice homes. So it was hard to do, but we had to take over some of those homes. Some were moved to other locations, others were demolished. And this caused hard feelings, of course, because there were a lot of people who had lived in those homes for generations. But we had to have more space for buildings. And there were a lot of buildings erected during the next several years because we had to accommodate the rapidly expanding enrollment. There was one year, I can't remember exactly which year, when we had more freshmen than all the other students combined. Over 3,000 freshmen, and there was under 3,000 of sophomores, juniors, and seniors. Well, you can imagine the kind of problems that presented. You needed housing for these students, you needed classrooms, you needed offices for the faculty. You had to have a lot more faculty. I think there was one year when they had over 100 new faculty at one time coming onto the campus. So there were all kinds of growth problems. And then you had a legislature that didn't quite understand the financial needs of the institution. So there was a constant battle to get legislative appropriations appropriate for the growth that we were experiencing.
And I mean, in those 10 years, it's just the physical campus. I mean, it's unbelievable, and I can't imagine. Obviously, you were on the front line of the town and gown relations. People were, I'm guessing, very unhappy that their homes were being taken away, and I've heard stories of people having their home bought by the state, moving a few blocks away, and then having that home a few years later be purchased by the state, and they had to move again.
Yes, that happened. And that was really unfortunate, but they should have realized they should have moved further away from campus, and because it was still growing.
Now, were you here, Ray? And I haven't checked into this, and I've been meaning to do some research. There was at some point, and I think it was in the 50s, but I could be wrong. So I'm going to ask you straight out. There was a proposal or talk of the university moving to the other side of the Mississippi River. Do you know anything about that? Can you tell us anything about it?
Yes, this was considered, but it got to be, it would be so difficult to pick up and move the whole campus. There was already quite a few, by that time, quite a few buildings.
What year do you think this was that they were talking about this?
Probably during the 60s, late 60s, perhaps.
Interesting.
And, Mankato did move its campus, but they didn't have to cross the river to do that.
They just had to move up the hill, right?
Yeah. So they finally dropped the idea because it just didn't seem feasible to try to the river was the obstacle. We just couldn't figure out how to move an entire campus on the other side of the river and know what you do with the buildings that are already there. Just abandon them? Or a split campus, with students going back and forth across the river? No. So we just stayed where we were and grew. And it eventually, the hard feelings subsided. The community was pleased to have such a good university, and the income that the university brought to the community, millions of dollars actually.
Yeah, the economic impact. We have those studies, and
yes.
I think the earliest is from the early 60s, and I mean, obviously the impact is tremendous on this city.
Yes, and it kept increasing too as the university grew. Well, the second president I worked with was Robert Wick, and Robert Wick was a really nice person, and he had been a dean. His field was English. But unfortunately, he was president during a time of a lot of student unrest.
And 65 to 71.
Yes. And there were student demonstrations and marches down to the city. And, the Vietnam War was coming along, and there were racial problems around the country. So he got caught up in that. And that was unfortunate because he tried so hard, and he did a good job of keeping things together. But there was one time when his office was occupied by African American students who had a list of demands. These things must be done. And he was sort of held captive in his office. But he wasn't intimidated because Bob Wick, he never said much about this, but he was a World War II combat veteran. He went through some terrible battles in Italy, so he wasn't about to be intimidated. But he did talk to these students, and they worked it out. There were some things that needed to be done. There were hardly any African American faculty or coaches. There were
and few students too.
Not very many students, and those that were there felt that they were being ignored. And anyway, there were things that should have been done, and were done. But it was a tense time, a turbulent time. So Bob Wick was happy to give up the presidency after a few years, and he was replaced by Charles Graham,
who just passed away
yes,
just a few weeks ago. I think he was 87 years old, I think.
Yes, that's right. Charles Graham, I think he came from Illinois by way of Wisconsin, and he was a political science professor, and he, I think, did a good job. He, for one thing, I helped him with this. He invited state legislators individually to come to campus to meet with him so he could make his pitch, to tell them what our university needed and why. And he did this several times, and I think it did get results in the legislature. He was here for 10 years. These were still turbulent times. There were still student demonstrations and marches and so forth. But he was able to handle it. And he was also here when the state legislature decided that the faculty had to go to collective bargaining. And it was the industrial model, which doesn't fit a university very well, but we made it work. But those were tense times as well. We never had a faculty strike, but we did have other employees, non-teaching employees, who did strike one time. And he had to experience that. But he finally, after 10 years, left St. Cloud to become president at Hamline University in St. Paul. And he did a good job there as well. Then Chuck Graham was replaced just for 1 year by Ted Gillette. Ted Gillette had been the graduate dean, and his main job that 1 year was to close the campus laboratory school.
Yeah, and how was, I know a little bit about it was a controversial decision, and I believe it was the only campus lab school left in the state.
That's correct.
And what kind of, and I know that people were pretty I don't know, I'd say worked up about it, but
Yes.
it was a tough decision that he had to make.
Well, it wasn't just his decision. The state college board made the decision, actually. It turned out that this laboratory school it had done a good job, but it was expensive to keep it going. And student teachers could get experiences they needed in public schools. They didn't have to go to the lab school.
It was sort of, I guess to me it was the college, the teacher's school was expanding, and it was really now a university, and teacher education, which still happens today, was just a smaller part of what was going on in this campus. And
Sure, that's what happened through those years. Well, it was originally just for teacher training, preparing teachers for elementary and secondary schools. That was the sole purpose of the institution. Well, as we grew, expanded, and more veterans came in after the war, they wanted other programs besides teaching. And so these programs were added, one after another. And it was still important that we had teacher education, and it still is today. In fact, we were training a lot of the teachers in Minnesota during that period. But there was need for these other programs, and they did well. Business, for example, mass communications, just a number of them. The next president, Ted Gillette, did succeed in getting the lab school closed. Another problem was that many of the students in the lab school were children of faculty members. So that didn't endear him to the faculty because they liked that school. But it was done. That building then was converted into a computer center. Ted Gillette went on to become president at Bemidji State University.
And he died just a few years ago again, yeah.
Yes. And then he was followed by Brendan Mcdonald. And Brendan Mcdonald had been a student here. He had been on the faculty here, or administration here, and then he was at Mankato, and he then became president at in Nebraska.
Is it Kearney?
Kearney
State.
Yes, Kearney State University. But he was chosen then to become president after Gillette. And he did a number of things that helped improve the programs, and I think he was very interested in athletics, particularly hockey, and it was through Brendan Mcdonald that we ended up with our hockey center, hockey became the number one sport on our campus, and it still is today. That was one of his contributions. Then he was still president when I retired.
And you retired in 1991.
Yes.
Yes.
After I'd been involved in the international program in Alnwick, England, 2 different years. I directed that program.
What years were those, Ray, that you were at Alnwick?
89, 90, no, let's see. Let me think back a minute. I know that the second year was 90, 91, and then there was 1 year, 2 years before that.
88, 87, 88?
I believe that's right,
Okay.
yeah. Anyway, my wife got to go with me, and we both, it was hard work, but we enjoyed it very much. An excellent program in the medieval castle. We got acquainted with the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. In fact, he was invited to come to our campus to speak at commencement. He declined, so his wife accepted, and she came over, the Duchess of Northumberland. Before she left Minnesota, they asked her what else she'd like to do. She says, I want to see the source of the Mississippi. So they took her up to Itasca, and she got to walk across the Mississippi.
Like so many of us have done.
Yeah. But that family had a lot of connections with the Smithsonian Institution. So from here, she went to Washington, and she was entertained by the officials at the Smithsonian. And I think overall, that was one of her best experiences. She really liked doing that. And when she got back to Alnwick, I was still there. And my wife and she invited us to come and look at her pictures. She had a bunch of pictures that had been taken here. Yeah, those are the highlights of the presidencies that I was involved with. There are other things about the history that we could cover. I don't know.
Can we back up a little bit? Can I ask you some follow-up questions about
sure,
the president?
Sure.
So, So I'm glad you reminded me about Wick and some of the student unrest that was going on. Uh, what sticks out in your mind that you dealt with directly? I know that there was it Ed Riker that was there was
Yeah.
a gentleman that was not retained on the faculty that the students were upset about, and I know the Day of Peace protest that was in 1972 when Graham was here. But with Wick, was there anything specifically going on that sticks out in your brain that you dealt with directly that you might want to tell us about?
Well, the Ed Richter story is one of them, of course. He was in the English department. He was rather radical and controversial, and he was not a pleasant person, actually. But students sided with him because he was not retained. And I think the day he left the campus, after being not retained, he drove around the campus and threw out firecrackers from his car as a protest. But fortunately, nothing worse than that. Well, there was just every day, you never knew what was going to come up next, whether it was going to be a sit-in or a march or a rally. There was just a lot of unrest.
What happened with when Kent State in 1969? I know I've seen photos at I say the University photographer. Thanks, Ray, for hiring the University photographer. Those images that were taken are all in university archives. But I've seen some of those images from Kent State, and they had a rally in front of Stewart Hall,
Yes.
and I believe they marched downtown St. Cloud. What were your thoughts about what had happened that day?
Well, we were all tense about that because we didn't know how it would end. And we didn't want it to end in violence. The townspeople didn't know what to expect either.
And this is it was a conservative town, and it
Yes.
still is a conservative place.
Yes, yes. But, and unfortunately, the police department had been geared up with tear gas and weapons and whatever. And I could just see real trouble as the students confronted armed police with tear gas. And I called the mayor at that time, Al Lair, and I said, "Do you know what's going on and what might happen?" And he said, "We'll put a stop to it. We're not going to confront these students. We're going to let them do their thing as long as they stay peaceful." And they did. They didn't tear up anything downtown. But these were tense times.
Right. And I know even obviously the Kent State, and I always forget about the other incident in the South, really, I guess, to me, ended the protests when students were being killed. But they had the Day of Peace protest when President Graham was here, and we have a lot of images of that, and it looked like it was a pretty big thing. So was the students from St. Cloud State, St. John, St. Ben's marched, and they gathered at Lake George. Do you have any impressions of that day, Ray?
Yes, it was another tense day. And you're right, other students joined ours from St. Ben's, St. John's. The fortunate thing is none of our protests ended up in violence. And I was thankful for that because that would have been a real disaster. They made their points, and they had reason to be upset with the Vietnam War and whatever. But throughout all this, there was not anything violent, no injuries, no deaths, and we were thankful for that.
Now I know, and I've seen images of this, and I've read a little bit about it. There was another protest. It was Richard Nixon's inauguration day in 1973, and it's funny. I had found an image of U.S. Representative Rick Nolan, who's now up in the Arrowhead. I always forget, is that the 8th District? But there's a really good image of him in front of the cathedral marching, and they ended up at the Civic Center, and there were faculty. Don Sinking is one that I remember seeing in some images. Do you have any impressions of? Do you remember that protest? And if so, do you have any impressions of that day?
There were so many protests. I can't sort them out, but
Sorry, Ray.
I was pretty much there during all those.
Yeah.
And I'd walk along with the students to make sure things were kept under control as much as I could. And it was tense, and it was difficult. It was not knowing what was going to happen next. So people were on edge. And the townspeople, they were wondering if their homes were going to be trashed, or if their cars were going to be, damaged or whatever. But it was just fortunate that nothing like that happened. It was right on the brink. It could have, but didn't.
That's good to hear, and I'm glad that we're not in some footnote of history of violent protests here in St. Cloud. Let's go back to Graham as well. He obviously had to deal with the after effects of the baby boomers not graduating and not being coming to college, and the university. I don't want to say shrinking. I know there were it wasn't growing anymore. It was and I know that there were faculty layoffs. I can't remember the acronym that was used, but I know obviously Graham had to deal with students. The baby boomers went to college. They've graduated. Now what?
Yeah. Yes, there was a reduction in enrollment. I think enrollment at the peak hit about 17,000, and then it started declining. And our funding, of course, is based on enrollment of our legislative funding. And when enrollment drops, we get less funding. Yet you have still some of the constant expenses, no matter whether you have 14,000 or 16,000. You still have to take care of a lot of the basic infrastructure of the university. So, yeah, there were some budget cutbacks.
And the recession, too. I mean, the country was going into recession. You had the oil crisis as well.
Yes.
So there were a lot of factors that were happening in that time.
Well, through the years, this university has seen a lot of that. There always seemed to be not enough funding for whatever they wanted to do, and yet somehow many of these things got done eventually. But it was, there just wasn't, we didn't have a big endowment for one thing, like some of the private universities. They can always fall back on their endowment. But we had to depend on student tuition and the legislature. That was our source of funding. And if the student enrollment dropped, we got fewer student funds. If the legislature wasn't generous, we got less legislative appropriations, and so we had to cut back on programs and faculty and whatever.
So with President Graham passing away a few weeks ago, do you have a good story that you may want to share about President Graham when he was here during that time, or not?
Well, I think he really understood the politics of working with the legislature and what it took to get legislators to understand what our needs were, because he was a political scientist. I don't have any particular stories, except that I know that he was very conscientious, and he tried. By that time, that we were in collective bargaining, and so he had. It was the administration versus the faculty. Well, that wasn't a good situation, and he tried to mitigate that however he could, but it was something he was forced into, and he couldn't change it. So that that wasn't just at our university. That happened all over the state of Minnesota. But I think he was a good president. I think he tried hard to keep all the programs going that he could, and he brought in good faculty. That was important. We had our faculty had a high percentage of people with Ph.D s. I think much more so than the other state universities. So they were academically qualified, well qualified, and he helped that to continue. So, yeah, I think we've had good presidents through the years, recent years, and in the early days we had good leadership too. We had people that wanted this to be a quality institution, and we were noted around the country for our teacher education programs. A lot of our graduates were hired not just in Minnesota but throughout the country because of our reputation of the then college, teachers college. We've had a lot of important people on our campus through the years. I just reviewed my book last
Your
night.
125th anniversary
Yeah.
book published in 1994.
Correct. On our campus, we have had Eleanor Roosevelt. She stayed overnight here, spoke here. Back in the 40s, we had President Eisenhower, who crowned one of our homecoming queens. Vice President Hubert Humphrey was here in '66 and other times. And we've had another vice president here, Nelson Rockefeller, a bunch of senators, Edward Kennedy, Barry Goldwater, Walter Mondale, Eugene McCarthy, Abraham Ribicoff. We've had Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, Jesse Jackson, Ralph Nader, Louis Armstrong, Bob Hope, Duke Ellington, the Vienna Voice Choir, Betty Friedan, Helen Reddy, and the Moscow State Symphony.
It's amazing the number of people and politicians, actors and actresses, musicians, you name it. It's amazing the number of people who have been on this campus, and I've heard students tell me like, "Wow, so and so was here. Why don't we have those traditions again?" And I'm sure there's lots of different reasons why that isn't happening, but there has been a tremendous amount of these famous people coming to campus.
There were some traditions too that we no longer have, but they were kind of interesting when they were going on. It used to be at end of the winter when the ice broke up in the Mississippi, a student would swim across the Mississippi. Usually a fraternity guy who was drafted to do it. And they greased him up like a channel swimmer and sent him across. That went on for several years. They also served free ice cream cones on the first day of spring, even though it might not be feel like spring.
It's usually like early May, yeah,
Yeah.
or mid-May.
And well, they had to give up the swim across the Mississippi because there was a near drowning, and that put an end to it.
Did you have to deal with that directly? I know that we
No.
have. Oh, you didn't, because I've seen the photos, and there's a story in the Chronicle of this gentleman being pulled out of the river, and they're like, "That's it," and they were done.
Yeah. Yep, that was the end of it. Of course, homecoming was a big deal in the early days. The parade downtown, the homecoming dance, and so on. But there got to be a problem with homecoming. There got to be rowdy students that were doing some bad things and drinking too much and setting fires. And so homecoming was even abandoned for a time, and they tried to substitute other things. I think it's coming back again, but
Yeah, that's the talk that it may
Yeah.
be back now. I know it was in 1988, and I know at that point you were not in the office in public relations. But did you have to deal with what had gone on in October 1988? So in 1988 they had. It was in October 1988. The so-called, I shouldn't say so-called. There was what they call a riot happened over that weekend, and obviously you had moved on from public relations, and you must have been in the College of, I always forget, Social Sciences at that point.
arts and sciences.
Arts and Sciences.
Yeah. No, I wasn't in public relations at that time, but I knew about the incident. It was a homecoming, and it was rowdy behavior, and some property was damaged, and I don't know if anybody was hurt or not, but Mcdonald was president, and he tried to make changes that he didn't cancel homecoming, but he tried to make it less rowdy.
Less rowdy, right?
And that, I don't know, that it didn't help that the bars downtown encouraged drinking, early drinking in the day, and by the end of the day, there was too much of it, and it did, affect the whole community. So they tried to get more cooperation on that from the downtown bars, and I think today it's not quite. We haven't had anything like that since that I'm aware of. But there are a lot of other things that have gone on that are positive. The university has really excelled in many programs. That we've got accreditation. I don't know how many programs now, but we've got a reputation in business, mass communications, electrical engineering. Oh, there's a whole list of where we've, of course, teacher education, where we've done well. We have, and these have all happened even though we've never received adequate funding from the legislature to meet our objectives. And I think a state university accepts students of all abilities, pretty much. There are certain standards, of course. But a prestigious university like Harvard only accept exceptional students, the whole student body. So they don't have to do a whole lot to get exceptional graduates. Whereas a state university, bringing in people from all different levels, they have to work harder to get students to excel in whatever field it is. And I think St. Croix State has done a good job of that. It hasn't been easy, and there have been ups and downs, of course. I went back, going back through my book, I ran across a few things that I might throw in here about our history. One of our past presidents was Waite Shoemaker, for whom Shoemaker Hall is named. When he was a boy, so the story goes.
I haven't verified the story, but please tell the story, Ray.
Well, Waite Shoemaker apparently led a cow several miles into St. Cloud and sold it to the then president, Keeley, to help finance his college education. And later, Shoemaker became president himself. So that was, and it's a dormitory named for him in 1915. That name was attached to the dormitory when he was dying of a lingering illness. There was the burning of Lawrence Hall in 1905. All the women had to abandon that burned out building, and people in the community, St. Cloud's community, took them in, and they put up a new dorm right away.
Yeah, it was less than a year after that fire that
Right.
they put up the new building.
Yes.
So if people ask about, well, Lawrence Hall was rebuilt, no, it's a brand new building. Well, it's a brand new building, but it's a different building than it was when it opened in 1885.
When you talk about student behavior, it was pretty strict back in the early days when we were in normal school. There were 2 students in 1870, 2 students were expelled, one for entering a pool hall and the other for riding in a carriage instead of attending church. Things have changed.
Yes.
Somebody tried to donate a piano to the school in 1873, and it was turned down because instrumental music wasn't a proper subject to be studied by teachers. So the library in 1878 had a total of 400 volumes. What is it today?
600,000. It's a lot bigger than that.
Yeah, it's big.
I have more books and archives than that.
Right. Everything has to have a beginning. There was one woman, only one so far, who served as acting president. That was Isabel Lawrence, for whom Lawrence Hall is named. She was the person who got Riverview building built, which served for many years as a lab school. But this woman, in her late 70s, Isabel Lawrence, lost her savings in the Depression, and she had hospital expenses she couldn't pay. The Alumni Association took the lead in raising money to buy her a retirement annuity. Oh, story after story. I don't want to go on too far with this, but when I did this history, I learned so much more about the institution than I ever knew.
It's a very rich history to be in. I don't know what your impression of it is, Ray. That I think a lot of people are just unaware of the rich history that there is at this university, and your book from 1994 and the Centennial volume certainly helps that. And having, should I say it, a functioning archives with an archivist who is professionally trained to be able to help people understand that history. So
Well, I'm happy about that too. In just 2 years, this university will celebrate its 150th anniversary.
that's right.
And I'm hoping somebody will step forward and do another history, bring it up to date. I don't know if that person's been identified yet or not, but it's time to get started on it, really.
Yeah, we'll talk about that after the interview, Ray.
Yeah, okay.
But actually, I have two more questions for you, Ray.
Okay.
I know I know we're an hour into this, but there's just two more questions I wanted to ask you. So in the late '60s, 1967, you left the university. You took a leave for 2 years
Yes.
to go to Michigan State. Now, why did you decide to do that? Were you encouraged to do that, or was that something you're like, you know what, I want to do this, and the time is now to do it?
I did want to get a doctorate. I had a master's degree, but I wanted to get a Ph.D. And I didn't want to wait any longer. I already waited quite a while. And I was eligible for a sabbatical. So I took that opportunity. I got a grant in order to attend Michigan State. I got into a program in higher education administration, a good program, and I took my family with me.
Were they happy to go?
No, not really. Our two daughters were, of course, in school here and had a lot of school friends. They had to leave. But they had good schools over there, too, in East Lansing. I enjoyed that program. It was a lot of work, and I had to work fast because I wanted to finish it up in 2 years. So after my first year of sabbatical, I applied for a second year leave of absence, and I was granted that. And so by the time I got back to St. Cloud, I had my degree. I did my dissertation on the Ombudsman in higher education. That's a concept of a person who helps students solve their problems, who's outside the framework of
Right.
the institution. Michigan State University had such a person. That's where I got the idea. But other universities did the same thing. And we never had one here, and I don't think the University of Minnesota ever did either, but many others did. I was invited to the campus, University of California, Berkeley, to meet with Ombudsman and to talk about this concept, because they were having a lot of problems on that campus, of course, Berkeley. And I don't know if they ended up, I don't think they ended up with a person called the Ombudsman, but it was somebody who was helped students with their problems who was not part of the academic or the administrative team. That is in student unrest, of course. That's why this came about. But in a few more years, the Vietnam War was over, things settled down. There wasn't that much need anymore for such an office, so it just pretty much died out.
So were you were happy to return to St. Cloud after those 2 years with your Now, did you finish your dissertation before you came back?
Yes.
So you did the coursework and you wrote your dissertation and you came back. So you were gone, was 67 to 69?
Yes.
And then you came back and you were still in public relations. Hopefully President Graham, or it was Wick, maybe it was Wick at that point. Maybe hopefully he gave you a little bit of a raise for
Well, he promoted me to full professor.
There you
That
go.
helped. Yeah, I had job offers elsewhere, and I did go for a couple of interviews, but I thought it over and decided I really wanted to stay here, and so I did.
So you were here through the 70s, and you I don't you retired you retired in 91, but you left public relations. It was at 85, 86. Now, was that an opportunity for you to try something else?
Yes.
And what happened, Ray?
Well, I really wanted to get into teaching. I hadn't done that. And so Don Sickig was the dean of arts and sciences, and he invited me to become assistant dean and teach part-time. So I accepted that. And it was different, but I liked the teaching part. I taught in mass communications. And then I had these chances to go overseas into the international programs. And I did that. I wrote a book about the program in Annick.
Which we have a copy in university archives in the university library if you're interested.
After 10 years, I wrote this history, and that was fun. I had a 1/4 leave of absence to do that, and it went well. I often wondered if at the end of my doctoral program, if I had decided to take one of these other opportunities, how it would have worked out. One was in Washington, D.C., one at the University of Florida. But I think I made a good decision to stay put, and I enjoyed the rest of my years here.
So you retired in 1991.
Yes.
And what have you been doing with your... So it's been like 25 years since you've retired.
I
and
know.
What have you been doing with your time? So it's interesting. You got here in 1959. And I'm going to admit this to you, Ray, because I think it's great. You've been here 57 years, 58 years. And every time I talk to you, I have to remember you've got that Missouri accent, even though you've been here almost 60 years.
Never shook it off.
So you've been retired since 1991, and what have you and June been doing?
I wrote another book about my boyhood in Missouri. I think you have that
We
too.
do have. I forgot about that book, Ray.
Yeah, that was fun to do. And I've got the material together to do another book on my undergraduate years at Missouri, right at the end of World War II. Those were turbulent years, of course, and I just haven't put it all together. But I've done the research, and I may yet. I've had a pretty relaxed lifestyle. I've had some health problems, which I had to endure, but I'm in pretty good shape now. I do physical therapy twice a week, and we go to concerts, we go to movies. I do a lot of reading and reminiscing. I don't get back to campus very often, but when I do, it's always a good experience. And I'm happy that the university has continued to do well. I think we're probably now going to get a new president one of these days. Who knows who that might be?
Right.
It could be a woman, which would be fine. We haven't had, except for this one exception, Isabel Lawrence. There's never been a woman heading up this institution, so it's high time. But we'll see.
Well, I appreciate your time today, Ray. I'm so happy that you came to campus and spent some time with me here at KVS Studios, talking about your time here at the university, your thoughts about the various presidents, the history that you shared with us that you were able to write in your 125th anniversary book. So I appreciate your time today, Ray.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Ray.
Okay.